So, for most of human history, trees were regarded basically as collections of trees, or forests were regarded as basically collections of trees. The logging industry operated on that assumption, believing that old growth forests could be cleared and then replaced with monoculture groves of saplings. About 30 years ago, Dr. Suzanne Simard started studying what was happening underground, and she found something surprising. Scientists had long known of the existence of mycorrhiza, vast underground networks of fungi that scientists even knew that these fibrous networks fused with plant roots and connected them, but they didn't know how important those relationships were. So here's a quote from a New York Times Magazine article. By analyzing the DNA in the root tips and tracing the movement of molecules through underground conduits, Simard has discovered that fungal threads link nearly every tree in a forest, even trees of different species. Carbon, water, nutrients, alarm signals, and hormones can pass from tree to tree through these subterranean circuits. Resources tend to flow from the oldest and biggest trees to the youngest and smallest. Because of the pervasiveness of these networks, a forest can actually be thought of as a single organism. Each tree in a forest acts as an individual, but the relationship results in something bigger. And the connections between trees are as important as a part of the forest as the trees themselves. I'm Michael Cale, and Emily Martins is my co-presenter. We're both user experience designers at Highland Software. And today we want to talk to you about systems thinking. So first off, I want to dispel any notion that what we're here to talk about is some kind of new fancy replacement for the design process. Design is a field that is constantly evolving, and so there are no shortage of buzzwords. But systems thinking is actually more akin to a mindset shift. It's a way of looking at problems and solutions with tools that facilitate the perspective. And it's a mindset that we think all designers and researchers should have. So I'm going to start with a quote from Donella Meadows' great book, Thinking in Systems, a Primer. A system is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. That's what a system is. So let's break that down a little bit. A set of things. It's really helpful to explain it in such general terms because systems are everywhere. And as you begin to start thinking in systems, you will see them everywhere. The number of things can be vast or few. The things themselves can be systems. Each thing has a purpose that it serves. So interconnected, these things have causal relationships that push and pull through feedback loops. The relationships between the things are as important as the things themselves. And so producing their own pattern of behavior over time. And this part is also critical in understanding these things that make up systems have their own purposes. Systems are emergent. No single part exhibits the behavior of the whole. A system is not the sum of the behavior of its parts, it's the product of their interactions. So what is systems thinking? Systems thinking is a way of looking at the world around you, the things in the world around you as products of larger systems in place. And it's also an approach to problem solving by understanding the systems that produce those problems. So coming back to the example of the forest, commercial logging practices were to clear cut diverse old growth forests and replace them with monocultures of Douglas fir. A narrow view of the newly planted trees understood the basics that they require: sunlight, water, and space, all of which these new trees had in abundance. But the newly planted forest actually proved to be vulnerable. Up to 10% of trees died when species nearby were cleared. The loggers had a narrow understanding of the system of a single tree, but they didn't have an expansive enough view of the larger system of a forest. So how is systems thinking different? In a conventional approach is reductive. So it's the belief that everything can be reduced down to its individual parts, and that B, that the system can be understood from those individual parts. But if you take a systems approach, it's really an expansive approach, looking at every system as a subset of a larger system. It's synthetic, believing that you can't really understand the thing until you understand its context within the larger thing. And so how that relates to UX is that if we apply systems thinking in a UX context, then we gain a understanding of the larger system, and it often reveals insights that would otherwise be lost. It can reveal leverage points throughout the system where impact will be greater. It allows for identification of multiple intervention points so that you can improve the system as a whole as opposed to solving a single problem. And in design, it's an approach that considers not only the upstream root causes of problems, but also the downstream consequences of the different solutions that we might propose. And it considers the relationships between elements in design as well as how those elements fit into the whole. So some good questions to ask. I'm going to start with coming back to the book by Donella Meadows, because she gives some great questions right at the outset. And the first and probably the most important is this a system? Can you identify the parts? Do the parts affect each other? Do the parts together produce an effect that is different from the effect of each part on its own? Coming back to that forest example, the effect of the parts of the forest together is an ecosystem, something that is the result of the relationships, not any one individual. And that effect endures over time. Other questions to ask, what are the upstream root causes of this problem? And what are the downstream consequences of the solution? And now Emily I'm gonna pass it over to Emily, and she's gonna walk you through a case study. This was a project that we did at Highland where systems thinking was actually very critical to the solution.
Okay, so before we get into the details, I'll provide a little bit of background context about what Highland does for those of you that don't know. So at Highland, we offer enterprise content service products that connect information, processes, and systems to securely provide the right information to the right people at the right time. And as designers, we often work with product management to create specific vertical or role-based applications. However, our products are also highly configurable, which includes the ability for customers to create their own low and no code applications. We're designing products just as much for the admin role as we are for the end user. So because we provide various tools for the administrator to tailor their own solutions, there's kind of a lot about the end user experience that we don't necessarily have full control over as designers. So just keep that in mind as we go through these next few slides. As we started to move more into the cloud, our team was tasked with addressing new global navigation needs and providing a mechanism for customers to switch between different applications within their implementation of the platform. So it's one system that could include several different applications, and they need a way to switch between them within the platform itself. A lot of our initial questions when we started this project were centered around the affordance itself. So should we expose the navigation like in tabs across the top so they can see everything, or should we hide it under some sort of like hamburger menu or some other like just button that you click. If we hide it, what type of menu should we use? And then how much vertical space can we give to the navigation? Those types of questions. As we explored different design options and ran our first round of usability testing, we discovered risks kind of regardless of which affordance we chose. You know, if we go with the exposed navigation, they have quick access to all their apps, but we're potentially burdening our users with cognitive overload. And past research has shown that customers usually just want to see what's relevant to them in that moment. On the flip side, if we choose a hidden navigation, we're kind of forcing our users to hop between different applications as if they're isolated islands. So we're starting to ask some why questions here rather than just how and what. Why do the users need to switch between these apps and when? Remember, our products are configurable and customers can create their own low-code applications. So use cases are endless, and while we do have a strong research team, we can't necessarily anticipate every single one of those use cases. And that's kind of why traditional IA tools like sitemaps and that kind of thing are not really an option for us here. This prompted us to move beyond just affordances and start asking questions like, how do we even define what an application is, or a feature or a solution? Can we reorganize these elements to create a more cohesive, effective end user experience? How much freedom do we really have here? And one of our usability test participants provided us with this helpful insight. I don't really think of these as separate applications. They're just functionality. I need to do my job. So our app switching illustration over here actually looks a little bit more like this in some cases. So switching between different features for one job rather than just different applications for different jobs. At this point, we're now thinking more about supporting the job to be done rather than meeting that technical requirement of app switching. But how do we design a navigation system around a job to be done when, again, because of our platform is flexible and has so many use cases, we literally can't know what that job actually is. This is an important shift in focus for us, but it also brought up a lot more questions than it did answers. It showed us that the system of navigation is part of a much bigger system that we need to consider and design. And I'll try to show you what I mean on the next few slides. So when we started this project, we had a few different entities, that set of things that we were considering. We had the end users. There are multiple applications that they have access to, and any global UI elements like menus and tabs, that affordance that we're working on. And they interact by, the end users access the different applications by interacting with the global UI elements. Seems simple, but again, as we've learned, it's not actually always that simple. Users might need to access features in different apps to complete one job. So how do we provide an easier way for users to access those features when, again, we can't know what all the jobs to be done are? Well, one option is to design a system that sets up administrators and developers to make those navigation choices. So now we've added the admin and some sort of navigation configuration, whatever that is, to the mix. And that's important because we have to make sure we're not just transferring the burden from the end user to the system administrator. These are people that already have a big job, and we don't want to ask them to now be UX designers too. Additionally, because security is so important to Highland's products, we have to make sure that whatever configuration solution we come up with can align with user permissions. So yet another thing that we have to design around to make sure we're not overburdening the admins. This illustration might be getting a little convoluted, but I hope you can start to see a little bit of a system forming already. Because in reality, there are way more entities and relationships involved. I've removed all the labels here, but just so you can get an idea of scale, this is an actual system diagram that we created to help us understand how all of these different elements work together to create this whole system. And if you take out any one part, or you don't consider the design of any one particular element, you risk potentially breaking the whole thing. You know, each decision that we make could have an effect, either positive or detrimental, in all of these other areas. So for example, if we skip the design of the configuration tools for the admin, they won't be able to do a good job building an end user experience. And then we're back to our original problems that we had of cognitive overload or taking users out of context unnecessarily. So we need to be responsible for creating conditions that set up the administrator for success. And we do that by identifying all of these different elements and understanding how they interact with each other, and not just digging in deeper to how these parts work individually. That's really the mindset of systems thinking. So we could have just met the requirements and delivered designs for an easy app switcher. It might not have always been the best user experience, but it would have been functional, and users probably could have still completed their work. That would have been a totally acceptable decision, I think, especially in an MVP stage. I can't show you our actual designs, of course, but with systems thinking, we were able to take this project a step further and redefine the problem and work with stakeholders to influence the product or the platform strategy on a much greater level, which has the added benefit of showing stakeholders the value of continuing to work with UX. I know that's something that UX designers are always going to have to struggle with. So that was helpful. And I do have some stakeholder feedback here to illustrate that. This is a snippet from a much longer, more detailed email from a product manager, but I'll just read this little part. So, as a longtime Highlander with a lot of context on what our product heritage has been, I think your team has hit on some really compelling design items that I think are spot on for helping us begin to understand how to really bring all of this modernization work together. To recap, we had this problem of having a lot of unknowns about the end user experience. So we took an expansive view of the whole system to identify the root causes of any roadblocks we ran into, as well as any consequences of solutions that we came up with. If we can't personally do all of the information architecture for every implementation of the platform, what can we do elsewhere in the system to achieve the same desired result without breaking anything? So now I'll hand it back to Michael to talk about how you guys can use systems thinking.
Thanks, Emily. So, I think the question is natural to ask, when is systems thinking the most helpful? And to be honest, it's really valuable throughout the entire process of design. I mentioned earlier that you begin to see systems everywhere, and you see them in small and large scale. So it's helpful in research and design. There's a lot of tools a lot of the tools that you would use as part of systems thinking lend themselves particularly well to investigation and problem definition. There is overlap between some common UX research tools and systems thinking, as you'll see in a moment. The artifacts that are generated through some of these activities are useful in design as well, because they help to visualize those downstream impacts. So tools and resources. We wanted to share with you some tools that we think are useful. Some of them you will probably be familiar with, others you may not. We only really can show just a few here. This is a topic that you can go very deep on. This list is not comprehensive, but it is representative, I think, of some key points in the design process. And the one is the first one I want to share with you is just, it's called the iceberg model, 4 levels of thinking. So this is really helpful for building an understanding of how problems can be the product of a larger system. So it's useful for shaping that understanding where, you know, the system produces events, and what we do, well, as human beings, not just as designers, we tend to live at the level of events. So to really adopt that mindset, you have to kind of work back from there and see the patterns that produce the events and the systemic structures that produce the patterns, and then the mental models that produce those systemic structures. So this is really a tool for kind of framing how you work backwards from there. Affinity diagrams, I believe most of us should be familiar with these. And this is helpful for early stage structuring of the problem. So you work as a team to develop an understanding of the scope of the problem, and it also helps identify those entities involved in the problem as well as their relationships. So, one of the things we haven't really discussed at length in this presentation is that when you are looking at a system, you have these entities and their relationships, and those are parts of what you begin to diagram out. And as you start exploring a system, what you find is that the scope can creep. It's a challenge to find the edges of the problem. So I think affinity diagramming is really helpful in that regard, because you can identify the pieces and parts that make up that system, and it kind of helps you visualize like where the edges of that problem might be. And the 5 whys, this is another great one. This is a root cause analysis tool, and it's used really just to go deeper to understand the problem behind the problem. It's flexible, which is another reason I really like the 5 whys. It doesn't have to be done in a single lane. There's, there's definitely more than 5 whys. So you can kind of go as far as you need to go with it, but I think it's really useful at kind of any point. And then causal loop diagrams. So this provides a visual representation of the entities involved in a problem and their relationships. So it helps create better understanding of the influences at work. This is one of those tools that would be good for identifying leverage points in a system, which are points where a change can have a significant impact in the way that it cascades throughout the system. Tools, another one is service blueprints or touch point maps. So it's kind of similar to a causal loop diagram in that it visualizes the entities and their relationships. It expands on the standard user journey map, and it shows the relationships between multiple users and products, all the people, resources, processes that interact in a customer journey. And then I have a few resources here. The first one, I've mentioned it a few times, is Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems of Primary. This is really a foundational book. If you only get one resource, I would recommend this one being it. She covers the subject very thoroughly, and I think that kind of says it all. And then here's a couple articles here. 6 fundamental concepts in systems thinking. The Systems Thinker is a website that has so much content on it, and it's very well maintained. You can go very deep on this subject. If you were, say, stuck in a pandemic with a lot of time on your hands and had the opportunity to read. So one of the things that, we've talked about these tools, we've talked about questions to ask. As always in design, the artifact you produce is not the point, right? The point is understanding. And for that, probably the most important question that anybody can ask if they want to move into a systems mindset is this question: why? Answers to why questions are called explanations, and the product of explanations is understanding. That's a quote from Dr. Russell Ackoff. He has a lot of great content out there on YouTube, books as well, but he's kind of a foundational figure in systems thinking as well. So like I said, the most important question that you can ask is why, and with that, I'll hand it over to see if anybody has any questions.
Participants, you can type your questions in the discussion if you have any questions, and we will get them. All right, we have one. Mark once says, I like how you featured Danella Meadows' work. Using nature to inspire is a great metaphor. What do you think is the biggest learning curve for someone first grasping thinking in systems?
That's a good question. So I think the hardest part is just, okay, so I think thinking back on my own experience, I would say the hardest part is probably understanding the equal weight that needs to be given to the relationships within a system. We just naturally have a tendency to focus on the things themselves instead of how they interact, and how they interact is really like the essence of it. So that's one of the reasons why we've tried to emphasize in this that this isn't like a paint by numbers process. There are tools that aid you in the way that you think, but it truly is like a mindset shift. You can look at systems and everything from financial, investing, and obviously nature, as we've talked about. Design is obviously the one that consumes us the most, but that's kind of the initial barrier, is just understanding that those relationships are as important as the things themselves. Emily, did you have any additional comment on that?
Yeah, I'll actually also add that specifically in a business setting, you're kind of, you might be against some stakeholder pushback. They're always trying to limit the scope and do what needs to be done right now. So you kind of have to find the time to ask these deeper questions and do this bigger exploration, even when developers or whatever are not ready to act on it right then. So you kind of have to make your case for taking this broader view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I just saw Keith's comment that the arrows actually matter more than the boxes. It's 100%, absolutely right.
All right, do we have any other questions out there? If not, then I would say let's take your chat or any questions over to under discussions. There's a thinking in systems to design for the unknown, where if anybody wants to discuss and chat any further on their presentation, please feel free to go over there and do so. Our live stream will continue in 15 minutes. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will continue with Sherry Thoreau, and we will probably do a drawing then as well. So be here, and hopefully you will win. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.